All right, welcome back to Free Association, folks. I'm Mark Lane, and if you've been paying attention to the news, there's a bit of turmoil going on in Egypt. It's something that our president has spoken about, that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has spoken about and given advice to the Egyptian government. And rather than looking at the political aspect of what's going on in Egypt, I'd rather like to take a look at the individual aspect. I'd like to take a look at it as though how the people in Egypt are responding to it. So to help us out with this perspective, I've invited Dr. John Grayzel, the High Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, to join us on Free Association. Welcome to the show, Dr. Grayzel.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. It's the Baha'i Chair for World Peace.
Okay. Well, can you describe the demographics of the Egyptian protesters?
Well, I don't know anyone who's done an exact survey, but the whole population in that area, over 65% is under 30. The mean age is about 23, 24, and since most of the people in the street would tend to be the younger one, it's a young group of people. I'd say it goes from teenagers to young. Though in Egypt, behind it, you have quite a bit of support within older generations as well.
Right. I saw on MSNBC.com on Monday that the protest, those leading the protests are folks under 30 years of age. I saw that on Monday.
In terms of the actual protests, yes, because young people tend to have the energy and a lot of the frustration. But behind it all, now I think you're beginning to see a few older generation figures trying to assert themselves into the process to affect and steer it, actually.
Now, one thing that we've seen is the police. They seem to have given up in Egypt. Now, is that because the police are outmanned, or is it because they're sympathetic to the protesters?
Well, you can't easily read into the heart of everybody, but sympathy is not necessarily a word that most Egyptians, in my experience, associate with the police in general. And in fact, their behavior is just one of the factors that have upset Egyptians for many years. I think it's merely a reality of the ability of police to deal with these types of situations. They can deal with individual situations, but ongoing and gigantic situations like this, they basically retreat for their own safety.
Now, Dr. Grayzel, you have lived in Egypt.
I've worked in Egypt. I never, resided in Egypt, but I worked in Egypt in international development.
Right. And you've also lived in Tunisia as well.
And I worked in Tunisia. I went back. I had projects there I was part of the U.S. Agency for International Development. I actually lived in other countries, Mauritania and other countries of that area.
Okay, so can you find any similarities between Egypt and Tunisia?
Well, there's a gigantic similarity that's between Egypt and Tunisia and other parts of the Arab world, and that's societies where the political leadership is generally unpopular with particularly the younger generation, and there aren't very many. In fact, there are no easily available ways in which the population can truly change that leadership. So but that's not only common to that part of the country world. The other thing that I actually think is more important is the demographics. These are both countries, and it shares this with other countries in the area, and that have enormous numbers of young people. The age pyramid is clearly weighted towards a tremendous, what we call youth bulge, and along with this youth bulge comes a tremendous loss of opportunity and for these people. These are young people who, in many cases, have received actually educations, but in fact now don't know exactly where they're going, and in fact, when they look at their opportunities, see almost a big zero. And so there's tremendous frustration, and it's not just economic, it's social, because it affects their ability to proceed in normal life, to get married, to get their own houses. They really are, in many cases, feel like a trapped generation with no clear vision of any opening of escape into anything more promising.
Well, since everything seems so hopeless and trapped for them, what role does religion play in helping to alleviate that hopeless feeling?
Because of the way the world is now, we tend to think everything is being driven by religion and that. I think religion is traditionally an important part of their life, more in Egypt, actually, than Tunisia. Tunisia is almost entirely Muslim. It has a few minority groups, and it's tended to be fairly tolerant of those groups. Egypt, mainly Muslim, though a very significant Coptic majority, and then some minority groups, even Baha'is and that. But particularly for the poorer group, it's been a key part of their lives in terms of just directing their own personal social lives. For another group, particularly in Egypt, it's been important politically. But I think what we're seeing now is not the results of religion. I think what we're seeing now is that religion can't respond to these needs and these frustrations. It's the failure of religion they practice it and how to actually deal with the problems that face them now.
Right, and these problems that are facing the Egyptian people now, is it part of a bigger picture that's being missed by outsiders, such as Americans?
If you see to it that this is really about the alienation and the desperation of younger people and the failure of older generations to actually deal in any way constructively in terms of providing them a meaningful future. It's actually a global situation. I mean, people may see this now as an expression, and particularly Americans, I think, of politics, of economics, and it is to some extent, but it's also an expression of psychological, social, and spiritual ennui. And it didn't necessarily just begin here. I think, I particularly by training also am an Africanist. A lot of the terrible things that we've seen in Africa over the years, in Liberia, in the Congo, is also an expression of this, and it's going around the world. It's even that the relations between the generations has sort of separated, and the younger generation is beginning to really feel as though it's being left to its own, and doesn't know where it's going.
Well, how worried do you think we should be about the possible outcomes? And are there other long-term concerns and actions you feel Americans should take in response to these events?
I think we should be very concerned, but I don't think we necessarily should be only concerned about them in terms of what's politically happening in the Middle East, because what's politically happening in the Middle East is disturbing under any scenario. So I don't think really this necessarily makes anything more disturbing than it was before these broke out, because it's sort of like a boiling cauldron, and, if it's going to spill over one way or another and then have to be dealt with. I think we should be really concerned because that underlying problem is already manifesting itself in other places. It's hard for people to imagine, but because we don't connect the dots often. But if you look over the last couple of years, as I said, events in Liberia, events in as exotic places as Timor, all very closely tied to youth alienation, what's happening in Mexico, and I think in our own country. And I think what we should be doing as a country is beginning to take much more thoughtful actions in terms of really beginning to think about these questions of intergenerational justice and what has to be done to begin to see that the future generation have what they need to thrive as people, as individuals, and as families. And even within our own country, I think, as strange it may seem, I think it comes down to things even that are happening in our own country in terms of the separation between the generations and the unequal distribution of benefits, resources, and the promises of the future.
Well, Dr. Grayzel, those are certainly interesting views on what's going on in Egypt, and I appreciate you coming on Free Association.
No, it's been my pleasure.
All right, Karen Kilowatt will have the concert calendar right after the break.